Hi there, Addison, and anyone else that is interested. Addison is a guy who's helping me to design some levels for Z0NE, and he asked me some good questions about what goes into a level, and I decided to make a video to answer him because it's simpler just to show than to tell these things. So let's look at what goes into making a level on Z0NE for Gear VR. The idea is that each level is made up of segments and which are made into sequences, and we string those together to make a level. So for instance, if I hit play here, you'll see that we start out, and you can see from up here that we've got this sequence at the beginning of just this trench with these squids in it, and then it changes the sequence to be this sequence which has arches in it. So let's look at how that works. So if we look at just the trench first, the trench segment 1, we'll see there it is. So he asked particularly, he said, how many objects should be in a segment, how many segments in a sequence, and how many sequences in a level? Well, let's start from the outside. Basically, everything is synced up to the music in Z0NE, so the sequence changes every 8 bars of music generally, so every 32 beats. So whatever sequence you have running, it will keep running no matter how fast you fly until it's time to switch to the next one. It figures out how much to build depending upon how fast you're going. And so the way that it does this is, if we look at the sequence associated with this segment, is called trench sequence 1, and it's right here. You can see this is the simplest kind of sequence because it's a sequence that has only one segment over and over and over and over again. So this segment right here, this sort of little trench that I made in Cinema 4D, it's just a couple landscape tiles together, it's a known length. It's 100 meters in Cinema 4D units, because we need to know that so that they are laid end to end perfectly. So this is a single mesh that is relatively low triangles. I think they're under 300 vertices each, and so this is enough to make a sequence. It's a single mesh that, when laid end to end, so if I go like this, lay another one end to end, just the right point, it begins to create a level. And that's what the engine does. It goes in and creates a whole bunch of these. Now the other thing, you asked how many objects on each segment. Well, there's two ways to put objects in a segment. First, you could just put a model if you wanted something in the same place every time, then that's one way to put it. But you can also define objects that you want to be spread around the segment using these things called spawners, which will spawn things in according to different rules. So for instance, if I've got this thing called a mine spawner right here, and see this green box? That box describes the area in which things will be spawned, and every time I press the button, it's going to create another thing, and in this case it's only going to create one thing. These are the opponents you see. But if I go to the spawner here and I say I want to create between 4 and 5 of these, it will randomly create that many. So depending upon the segment length, that's going to determine how many of these things you put in. But you don't really need to worry about that when if you're putting things in that are designed to be sort of scattered around, like obstacles or things to shoot, because I can decide that later. So that's a very simple single segment sequence. Now let's look at another way that this can work. Here's a corridor. Now here's an example of one that's longer. This is 800 meters. This is just a single mesh I brought in from Cinema 4D, and what I want to happen is I want there to be cross beams here, so that when you fly through it, there's things to dodge up and down. So what I did is, see these green lines up here? These are spawners. There's cross beam spawner 1, 2. There's 3 of them, and what it does is, if I hit go, what it does is each time it will spawn cross beams in a different place to make it different each time. But since the spawning area is very defined, it's basically just changing the vertical on them. And so I've got something that's always fun to fly through because the spawner will put these things in different places each time it brings one of these segments onto the field. And so it never gets, you can never really learn the level completely. So here's another example where here's a segment which is a single mesh. It's a bunch of meshes combined in Cinema 4D, and then another mesh, a single mesh, which is basically just a beveled rectangular object that has a nice substance designer texture on it, and that's a segment. And this one is 800 meters, and it's fine to mix and match segments of any size as long as you know how big they are, because you have to put that into the engine. It doesn't detect that right now for various reasons. So if we, let's clear this out. Now let's look at a little bit of a more complicated example. Not complicated, but one thing you can do with sequences. So we've got this ring segment here. See, it's very, very short. And so if we've got the one guy in here. But then I have another one called ring segment 2 that looks like this. And if I drag it out and see stack it end to end, you can now create sort of an alternating repetition if you define in the sequence that you want first segment 1, then segment 2. And I also have another segment that goes with it. That this illustrates something that's pretty interesting too. This segment, which I will drag out here into the front so we can play with it, has nothing on it except a spawner. This is called cloud segment. So what it does, it has a single cloud spawner that spawns clouds. So what I do with that, if you hit move, see, it's going to put clouds in different places. So you wouldn't necessarily want a sequence of only clouds or only these things with the rings in them, because it would be too hard to fly through. But if we look at the sequence over here, it's called cloud sequence 1. And you'll see up here that in the sequence we have an order of what we want to draw. We want to draw cloud segment 1, ring segment 1, cloud 1, ring 1, cloud 1, ring 1, cloud 1, ring 2. And so what this means is we only get these spinning crosses every eight segments. So when we put it all together, if I put that in the beginning and we play, you can see the result of stacking those things together. We've got this to fly through. And I use a script a lot called steady spin that just spins things, and it's spinning those crosses there like that. So that's another way you can make that illustrates a lot of the things you can do in making a sequence. Now, as far as how many there are in the game, generally there's been about 12 or so, because the mode that we've been demoing out has always been a 3-minute game, and so if you just do the math on that and you are switching every 8 bars of music and you figure out the BPM of the track, that means you need about 12. I may add modes which add more than that, and I'm actually looking at putting an endless mode in for the Gear VR that will just sort of randomly pick the next sequence for as long as you want to play. So that's really what goes into it. Let's see if there's anything else that I haven't told you. So usually most segments will have something or things that are clearly defined. For instance, if we look at yellow arch and trees, okay, there's 2 meshes there. There is this floor and there is this arch, and that could have been made into one mesh in Cinema 4D, but I don't think I really need to do that. And then there's also a spawner. So usually there's 1 or 2 meshes which define what I call the hull of the level, except in the case of the clouds when there is no hull. And so then you have usually 1 or 2 things that spawn things in it, like this one spawning little cartoon trees and a mine in there. So that is about what goes into making a segment. Let's look at some of the other ones. This one is just a simple tube with a spawner in it. And that's about it. That's about all that goes into it. So I would say at minimum you want a hull and then 1 or 2 objects that you can describe to me how you want them distributed throughout it, and then I can turn that into a playable section of the level.